Many people regard you as a personification of Ubuntu. What do you understand Ubuntu to be?
In the old days when we were young, a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? These are the important things in life. And if one can do that, you have done something very important which will be appreciated.
The open source report on July the 10th, 2019 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. We do our open source report, which highlights, I should say, open source hardware and open source software. We've been doing this now for a number of years with Cranston Software, a open source consultancy. Nonetheless, open source has become big business. We have some interesting news here. Cloudera, a provider of Hadoop software, has now decided that they are going to open source their entire catalog and use a model similar to the one that Red Hat has been using the last 20 years, where they offer services and the software comes without cost. Cloudera had merged with Hortonworks, and we'll have that story here in a minute. Let me just go to our lineup here, hopefully. We always start open source reports with an introduction on what Ubuntu actually is by the late president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, explaining the concept of Ubuntu, what it means, and how it not only applies to software and hardware, what we're talking about today, but to the life. He gives an example of a villager that is out and about on the road, and he would go to a village, and the village would give him water and give him food as a collective method. And we at Cranston have always upheld these principles and the principles of the Free Software Foundation. So we not only look at open sourced software, but Libre software, and we are now running with this broadcast 100% of what we are doing here, or almost 100%. We're using Ubuntu, so some Ubuntu does put some proprietary software in their distribution. Our normal distribution is Slackware, and we normally run Slackware, but on this particular mobile unit, due to some hardware problems, it is running Ubuntu. And we also have the Ubuntu Creative Suite, we'll call it. And this particular version of Ubuntu is running the 5 kernel here. I'm not sure. I think it's 5.1.17. And we always start with the kernel. The latest kernel, a stable kernel, is a 5.2. And I believe we have 5.1. 1.6 or something of that nature. I'd have to look it up to be precise on that. But the kernel has advanced to the main line now. It was out on the 7th of July 2019. And several others here. Slackware I'm not certain about. I believe we are running 4.1.19, perhaps. These are long-term kernels. But nonetheless, any of these kernels, and we strongly suggest to people that in the Linux world, or even if they're in the Windows world, some are there, that they keep their software up to date, especially some of the various components there that need to be updated from time to time. Slackware does a good job of doing that. Ubuntu, as far as the kernels, they push the kernels out. Slackware is much more careful with what they do with the Ubuntu people, which is based on the Debian distribution. It's an offshoot from Debian. And they tend to do a pretty good job, especially with the security parts of it. Now, the newer kernels, some change in terms of hardware. There's not a lot, according to the last thing I read from Linus here. So what we did today was put together a shorter version than we normally would do for this type of presentation. We're trying to cut down all our presentations. Nonetheless, the Business Insider, we utilize some polling information from there, some of the best in the business. Anyway, nonetheless, Caldera is now at according to this, $5.11. Now, I'm not. I have to look and make sure my dates are going forward here, because there's been a number of changes at Caldera, and I hope I pronounce it that. Anyway, it is a $1.4 billion enterprise. The CEO is moving away from it, or has resigned. There, they've had some disappointing results as of late here, and the announcement, of course, was made on Wednesday, and I don't have the precise date here, but they are moving to open source. And as we said earlier, they had merged with Hortonworks. Hortonworks was another provider there. Cloudera had been some big changes this year, 6 months ago. Of course, they merged with Hortonworks, once one of its bigger rivals there. About a month ago, it suffered the worst day on the market ever, losing 42% of its value as the CEO, Tim Riley, announced his departure. Before officially left the company at the end of the month, Cloudera is making a big change to its business model. It's giving away its products for free, and they do have some very good products. And all of their software will be available under the open source Apache license, or the Alfredo general public license, meaning any of it will be free to anyone, even to download, modify, and use as they wish. That includes features that customers might have previously paid for in the past. Now, they are taking on a service model. It's interesting. Atros Perot passed this week, the Dallas software entrepreneur. Atros Perot started out as a salesperson for IBM. At that time, IBM was selling hardware. they gave away the software. These were mainframes in the early 60s. And Prospero seen an opening there in selling services. To that point, no one was really interested in selling services to corporations. They were selling hardware, not even software at the time. So thus he got into the services business, and he was with his EDS Service Corporation did a very good job of getting government contracts. One of his big contracts was with the state of California. They were instrumental there in the California social services sector, providing those services there, cutting relief checks, etc., in California, and also many major government contracts. He then sold the company to GM. GM actually at one time was a very large company. This was before the Depression hit, and they were downsized, and they almost literally lost the house, so to speak. Anyway, nonetheless, that's sort of the story of his company, and he was on the board of, this is H. Prospero, of GM. Now, this is way before we had open source, and we did not even have Unix at the time. The people at Bell Labs had not put together Unix. But remember the experience of Unix, that you basically had user groups. The software was parlayed around free of charge. We really didn't have proprietary paid software in mass amounts until Microsoft and the PC came in. But now there were some programs on the mainframe that were proprietary, some of the languages, that sort of thing, but that really had nothing to do. IBM was not interested in selling those, and of course, some of and IBM was the largest mainframe house at the time, and the better known for the public. And of course, you had other Sperry with the UNIVAC computers, remember them, and various others. We'll get off into that, but what we are talking about here is the evolution of open source software. So this is a very important move here that Cloudera has made. We talked to industry experts, and we talked to some of our peer companies. It's aligned to Red Hat's model that exists today. We adopted that model as well. They're 100% committed. Both Cloudera and Horton Works are based on the core of Hadoop. Now, Hadoop itself is under the Apache license. You can go there, download it for free, and you can modify it. Now, it was originally a popular open source, I'm reading here, was originally started at Yahoo, and both offer free open source versions of their tools. But flavors different, licensing schemes further complicate the matter that Cloudera paid a premium version for businesses built on top of the open source software. Sylvester, who came to Cloudera in the Hortonworks merger, said that immediately after the tie-up, the newly combined company wanted a business model that 100% committed to open source, but streamlined to use the same pair of licenses to make it easier for users and customers to understand it. And we've talked here about licensing before. This is something we're working on since day one. Meanwhile, while Raleigh might be leaving, Sylvester said this business model is here to stay. And some companies have done very well at that particular situation. And let's see, we're pushing is really transparency. There are key tenets that the board and leadership team will continue to drive after, of course, Tom retires. Cloudera is the only open source based software company that's changed its business model. Chief also made a decision to make all of its open source software and focus on customer service support and software updates in a similar manner. Now, I'm not certain here, and of course we are live. I had just looked at this as it is an IT automation startup called Chief. There's $360 million, not cheap at all. I think I saw something in passing about them once, and let me just go back up here. This is an IT automation startup, is bucking a distance trend in open source software with a big bet on making all of its products totally free. Now, that is another way of looking at it. The service standpoint there is always something that has been out there. And I had a big debate back in, I believe, 2001 with some people from Red Hat as to how they would be able to sell their particular product. Other companies, labs, Mogo, DB, and Confluent have gone in other directions now to defend against what they say is a trend for cloud providers like Amazon, Alibaba, which often take open source code, package it up, and sell it to companies as a service. Now, this is software as a service. One of the big things that Microsoft would put Linux in and sell it out there, and writing new licenses that place restrictions on how the code can be used, and sparking, of course, the debate in the open source community. Cloudera looks to these companies for examples, but it decided not to pursue that particular route. Now, that's going to be interesting when we get into software as a service. That is something that's been around. That's sort of like the old, at one time, that ran afoul of various license regimes. There was a move at one time just to rent software, just simply to rent it, and that was a little bit different situation, because this was licensed software. Like, for instance, you could rent a Microsoft product or whatever for 2 or 3 days, go home and copy it and return. Now, this is a little different model. This is actually using something that is free, and then you modify it and then you sell it as a service. Now, you're not selling the software product itself, you're only selling the service. So if you're a cloud provider and you have whatever program you have, and you're just selling it as a service. Example of that is Microsoft now has their Office 360, which they sell as a service. In other words, you don't buy the software, you just effectively rent or lease the software. The same with Adobe. They are doing basically the same thing. Adobe is renting you the types of software that you used to buy a copy of, and that is potentially much more money, because you can rent it some for only a few days, and most people it's 6 months or a year. So that's recurring revenue. Whereas if a customer bought the software, it would depend. They would get updates to it, and they could be 5, sometimes maybe 10 years before they actually would go to a different type of version. So these are some of the things that we're seeing here. It says Amazon is making over $100 million from one of its open source business, but the CEO behind the original software says isn't slowing down its business. I assume they're talking about software as a service here. You would have in the same area, you would be looking at Azure, which is the Microsoft implementation of it. There are more software as a service there. And it's interesting here. Now, this is CBR here. They're one of the business, not graced them before, but it came along in the search pattern. Now, this is back to Hadoop. Hadoop Wrangler, they call it, bucked the trend to tighten control of open source code by protecting it under even more restrictive license. Today, announcing plans to all in on the AGPL and the Apache 2 license, making the licensed components of its products open source and doubling down on the Apache Software Foundation's activity. The commitment by these U.S.-based enterprise specialists will extend its forthcoming Cloudera data platform, the company's much awaited joint project with Hortonworks, following last year's $5.2 billion merger, which closed in January this year, hopes to emulate a Red Hat's customer support model. Also, at this point, Oracle does have a Linux version, and they also able to get the with their database. What was the free database there? Anyway, whoever they were, I forgot who they were now. But anyway, so they are doing it as a service also. That's why people went to something a little different. This is Computer Business Review, the name of this. Reality is that large cloud infrastructure providers, as it stands today, can easily take the open source bits where they do or do not contribute back to the community and compete vigorously with them. Now, again, this is from Mick Holson. Anyway, and Data Stack Patrick McFadden described the move to the Computer Business Review. He added is an interesting choice. That's the AGPL, in that the license originally conceived in the world of software as a service, not as brilliant as some of the other recent licensing moves, but their move could be telling. Apache 2 essentially makes software free to copy and use in AGPL, makes it free to use. But if you use the AGPL license code, you have to make your software open under the GPL. Now, it's a little different from inspired through Red Hat. Maybe Cloudera has a long ways to go before it comes close to emulating the company's success. The announcement today, the departure of the CEO, and operating losses of $35 million. All of the open source projects that we contribute to are hosted by the Apache Software Foundation. We continue to be ASF project. That's what Cloudera said. Pledging to take the Cloudera management, the Cloudera Navigator, and data science workbench open source. Now, that'll be interesting. We'll be continually following this story, call it a story, because it is very, very interesting indeed. Now, following IBM's acquisition that closed yesterday. So this is current here, at least this report from the Computer Business Review. With more than 700 engineers that are part of the new Cloudera, our company writes a prodigious amount of open source code. We also an innovative open source company with more than a dozen open source projects launched since the founding of Cloudera and Hortonworks. We've taken our open source leadership role seriously and recognize the need to align Hortonworks and Cloudera's licensing model as an opportunity to renew our commitment to free software. So they are using the word free, which is liberate software. This is very interesting here, and it'll be interesting in days to come on how the liberate and open source movement reacts to this. Let me just grab a few other little things as we close out here, spend some time here. This is AMD, and we at Cranston, back to 20 years ago, were AMD resellers at the time, but we actually made production boxes and servers and that sort of thing. We no longer do that, but at the time that we did. This is the AMD Ryzen 9 with, 3900X Linux memory scale of performance. Now, this is interesting here, the types of RAM that they're using. The AMD X570 and a new Zen 2 processor. This is the 3600X. Some of the benchmarking here. And there's been a lot of rambling about this. In case you missed it, the new AMD processors offer native DDR4 3200 memory support, while back AMD press briefing, they recommended DDR 3733 as a sweet spot there. They said that DDR 451 can be achieved on air-cooled with mild overclocking. Now, that is one of the history of AMD processors. You could always overclock them, as opposed to Intel, you'd burn down your house. Anyway, for the purposes here, they ran these tests using the 3900X AMD one, and they use a Jesus Crosshair Hero there, and they use a Coursera MP600 here. Let's see, what would that be? An SSD. Oh, okay. And 8 gig of DIMM, not a lot, but anyway, this overall test here, you can look at it. But these processors, the AMD Ryzen's, not this one, but are getting much more inexpensive to use. And if you need a nice workstation, that would be the way to go, to build a server. Of course, if I build a server, I would run it on as I should say, as the OS. I'd run a Slackware edition there. Now, AMD's two processors support collaborative processor performance. Anyway, this is AMD is moving on with CPU. Some drivers here support. The Linux 5.3 continues advancement Intel sound open firmware. Now, this is, we'll take a brief look at this, and be probably the last thing we'll look at today in this presentation here. Now, the Linux sound subsystem maintainer, let's see who it was, is this is in Linux 5.3 is continuing where Linux 5.2 left off, adding a lot of sound open firmware kernel code that has been in deep development for over a year, as the Intel effort for having open source audio, and this is something that has been talked about, and one of the things that we've been trying to develop as kernel. Now, This is the open firmware here, and newest and future Google Chromebooks. Others will use case to come out with this. So this new kernel is very interesting. Now, I'm not certain how long Google Chromebooks will be using the Linux kernel, but we assume that now some other changes here, just briefly here. The Cirrus Logic, what is it? CS47L35, and I see a RETAC RT 1011 and RETAC RT 1308 support, adding it to it. So again, these are some of the companies that have been around for a very long time, and they're adding some drivers to them. Anyway, this will do it for us. And the open source report here, as we wind things down. We've been a little remiss here in bringing out open source reports, but they are back. And incidentally, you can now find them finally on the Google podcast. So if you're obviously running Android, they used to have Android podcasts. They have merged these together, so you can find us there. You can find us on iHeartRadio. You can find us on Stitcher. A lot of mobile devices coming in there. You can find us on YouTube, the open source report there, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Spreaker, and various other outlets there. And we have some open source reports still, as far as I know, over at the old Blog Talk. We haven't been making any new ones there, but we do have some of the older archives there. And also we have archives on the general archive. We'll get some open source reports up there. I guess at this point in time we don't have any. But some other things from the Boston Red Network. This is the Internet Archive, and we'll get a link up there and do a little bit of, as they say, housekeeping here. Good day.